Welcome to the Healing Pathway, Part 5, a brief review and the discussion of our vulnerability, trauma, and the entrance of evil. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining me today on the fifth presentation of the Healing Pathway series. Today, I would like to talk with you about emotional trauma, which I have been calling woundedness, emotional wounds, the entrance of evil, and taking a look at, again, a couple of healing practices that will help us along the way. I also am going to start with a brief review of where we are up until now. I've been doing a lot of thinking since the last time I did a presentation, and I am, of course, behind on my schedule of presentations, but it's because I've been pondering what it is that you, the listener, might actually be more interested in than some of the things that I have been saying, or perhaps more clearly, to be able to show you exactly what I have been meaning. So let's begin by talking about the occurrence of a trauma, an emotional trauma, and what it is that actually takes place in us when that happens. Now, I know I've talked about this a couple of times, but one of the things that I did talk about was the special place inside, which I have been calling a place of tenderness. And then, if you remember from the diagram, there were concentric circles, and around this area of tenderness inside, there existed a circle of what I call gentleness. And gentleness is an action, or rather here, multiple actions. And there are ways of taking care of that tender place inside of us. And what happens when we receive a trauma, when we receive a wound that overpowers us, is that we stop taking care of that tender place inside. Gentleness is the first thing that becomes attacked. Those actions that we take to take care of ourselves are the first things that become attacked when we receive one of these profound wounds. And so, for example, we suffer a tragedy in our family, and we lose somebody unexpectedly. And all of a sudden, we don't feel like leaving the house anymore. We just want to stay home. And then all we feel like doing after that is watching TV or somehow entertaining ourselves, being entertained, which our culture provides lots of. And then maybe after that, all we feel like doing is sleeping, staying in bed. So the things that we usually would do, like getting together with our friends, or going out and socializing, maybe at church or a club that we belong to, or something like that, we stop doing that. And that's one of the ways in which we are gentle with ourselves. And when we come home from those activities, we used to feel good. Now, one of the real downplays the real tragedies of this current coronavirus problem that we're having is that a lot of these things that we used to do, which were ways of being gentle with ourselves, a way of sharing our wounds, maybe, or finding ways in which to find healing activities, have now been taken from us. So we have to be especially careful, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this series with you, is so that perhaps even just for a minute here with me, you would find a way to think about taking care of yourself, because there are some things you can do. And as I go through the healing practices, some of which I have already started. Last time I talked about sacred bonds, making a list of them, really thinking them through, finding more of them, enhancing the ones you have, however you can now, and those kinds of things. These are all ways of being gentle with yourself. Okay, so think about that area of tenderness inside. And again, I'll repeat, that is so important for me that you think about it, because it is the area from which your healing emanates. All right, so let's move on a little bit then. And in terms of this review that I wanted to do with you, when we have one of these traumas, these emotional woundings that takes place in our life, we, in our culture at this time in history, are given two paths to walk. All right, and one is the path of medicine, which is heavily influenced by psychology. Now, psychology simply means the study of the psyche, all right? And what that involves is a scientific approach to what's happened to us, just like medicine would approach a scientific event that took place in your body. Psychology is heavy on diagnosis in our field, and very light on treatment. I'm sorry to say that, but that is my opinion about it. We're much better at diagnosing people in the traditional psychological sense than we are in treating people. So we have this path to walk down of psychology. Now, psychology could involve finding a good therapist who will provide meaningful discussions with us, encourage us, challenge us, and perhaps help us to gain some insight into what we have lost and why we're reacting the way we are. And that's all good, okay? There's nothing wrong with any of that. And you will probably find along the way, if you have depression, which I'll talk about in a minute in more detail, you'll find, or anxiety attacks, or if you have some of the physically based illnesses, genetic illnesses, you'll find that the field of psychiatry, has made great advances in providing medicines that might be able to help you. And that's good. All right. And as I said in the first time, if you're finding something like that along that path that is working for you, don't stop. All right. Don't stop. Keep going. But there is another problem with that. And the problem with it is that it has taken a very arrogant approach, if I can be direct about it. And the approach is that it is the only way, right? That it's the only way to get better is to do the things that walk along that path. Now, while those things may be essential and necessary for a lot of people, they're not the only way. All right? There has been a way since the beginning of mankind, since the beginning of our having trauma or wounding, there's been attempts to find ways to heal. And there have been successful ways to heal developed along the way. And that is a whole nother path. And that's what I have been calling the healing pathway. And it's been the emphasis of my work. All right? We cannot, at our own vulnerability, we cannot dismiss that pathway. All right? Now, in many situations where we're hurt badly and can't recover on our own, we may have to take both paths, and there's nothing wrong with that. But taking one path alone will never solve the problem. In other words, if you truly want to heal and not just feel better, like I said the first time, you have to involve the spiritual. Healing always involves the spiritual. All right. So that's by way of review about where we are up until now. These paths, these two directions that we can take, each have their own stories. And if you study long and hard enough, you understand that the story of each is a good story, and that they have been through a great process of arriving at the present time. And we are quite gifted by having received sort of the ultimate in what the current medical approach to our illness might be, or the great spiritual healing contributions to what our woundedness may be. And so we have the ability to combine these things. And so they have a story, just as we have a story. Now, one of the things that I have really enjoyed doing over my time in reviewing all of this for my whole life has been in creation stories. And creation stories are present in every culture, and they always start with the idea that things are perfect. Okay? Just like the creation story in the Bible, and God created things, and one after another, 5 times, he pronounced what he had created as good. Now, the first thing he created, though, he did not pronounce as good, and that was the separation between himself and mankind. Okay? That he did not say was good. So, but the rest of the things were good. And then what happens in all these different creation stories from all over the world is that something goes terribly wrong. And for many of us, personally, that's how we experience life, is that for a long time, things were quite good, right? Maybe great. I have a 4-year-old grandson who came up to me the other day and told me, I always want to be 4. I said, well, don't you want to grow up someday and be able to do things like your daddy does? Nope. I want to stay for. And see, that's it. That's the essence of it. Before we get split and things can happen to us that hurt so badly, and he didn't even know the wisdom of what he was speaking, of course. But the reason I bring all that up is that I think that for each of us, especially those of us who have had trauma in our lives, we had a time when things were perfect, when things were really good. Maybe not 100% perfect, but at least we experienced joy in life, and there was a lot of stuff that was really quite good. And then something went terribly wrong. And so one of the things that I want to do, and I'll be doing this with you later, and I may even take a separate offshoot and do a series of talks to assist people on how it is that we can actually write our own stories. But I want to help you make your own creation story, the story of your life. Now, this doesn't have to be, if my name is Rich, it doesn't have to be Rich's story. As a matter of fact, this is my healing story. And it's a story about a little girl named Mary. And Mary is not meaning Jesus' mother in this book. This is the story of Mary, who is a young child who is wounded in her life, and then goes through a process of healing. Now, when I started this story, it was unconscious to me. I started it by teaching the story to a group of social workers to teach them how to do story building, is what I call the exercise, with their clients. And it was only after months, maybe a year, of writing and rewriting and getting more involved in this story that I realized that it was my own story. And it turned out to be a very healing event in my life to have written the story. So I have sort of perfected, at least in my opinion, a way in which I can help other people to write their own stories, a healing activity. And I have listed this as one of the healing practices. Again, another way of being gentle with yourself in a time of great emotional distress. All right, so we have these stories. This is an activity that I'll be discussing with you in some detail. But why do we have all these things? Why is it that when things are supposedly going well, that all of a sudden things have to go terribly wrong? Why is it that Adam and Eve have to eat of the apple? Right? Why? Well, I'm not sure it's a very useful question, because the only answer I've ever been able to come up with is because we're human beings. And it is our nature to need to have these losses and these trauma in our lives. And if nothing else, like I said before, if we don't have to deal with this right now, and we escape all of the potential serious trauma that could happen in our lives, we will eventually face illness and death. Okay, so that's inevitable. We will have trauma in our lives. So when we're walking the healing pathway, we have to assume loss. We have to assume wounding. We have to assume trauma. And what happens when we have a loss is that we are left very vulnerable. All right? Now, I don't believe in the idea of original sin. All right? I had the great gift of being present at the birth of all four of my children. And I will tell you that there was no sin in that room. All right? No original sin. But as I left the hospital that night, I found myself in tears about the vulnerability to which this child had just come into the world. All right? Vulnerability, original vulnerability, is what we have. And what's waiting for us just around the corner is the entrance of evil. Now, I have talked with you before about the fact that the healing pathway, not the scientific pathway, but the healing pathway must assume the presence and reality of evil. It is real, and it is there to harm us, intentionally harm us. And therefore, we must be prepared for the idea that, number one, we are vulnerable, and number two, when we are most vulnerable, which is immediately after a loss or a trauma, when we are most vulnerable, evil is most likely to enter. It's just its nature. You know, it will harm us when we are most susceptible to harm. Okay. So we have these events that take place sometimes almost overnight in us, and all of a sudden we're left in a state of having suffering about to occur in our souls. And so what do we do next? The first thing that we must do is we must realize that there is great hope for us to climb out of these traps that we fall into. There is great hope for us to climb out of these traps, these evil traps. And this is one of the primary offerings that the healing pathway has for us that the scientific pathway may not have. So if you go to a medical doctor, the medical doctor will do some tests maybe and come back and say to you, well, here is the diagnosis, and here is what I can do for you, and here's what I cannot do for you. And often you're far more interested to hear what cannot be done. What are you simply going to have to live with? The healing pathway does not take that approach. The healing pathway says, here is what we have to offer you, and there is great hope for you to achieve, as I said the first time, the life you are always meant to live. However, you're going to need to climb out of this trap, of this hole that has been dug for you by your own vulnerability, which, of course, you don't blame yourself for, because we all have it. It's part of being human. But you still have to climb out. And so I have put this schematic together to show you two ways of, general ways of climbing out of the trauma that have been handed to us by life. So let's take a look at this now. In my study of all healing pathways from various religions around the world, I have found that there are essentially these two methods of climbing out of a problematic time in our lives. The first peak that we need to climb, the first mountain we need to climb, is the mountain of knowing about God. And this mountain comes from study, it comes from spiritual writings. For Christians, it comes from the Bible, from other faiths, it comes from their holy scriptures. It comes from great sermons. It comes from classes that are taught at our churches and other places of worship. And so we have all these different sources, and they all teach us about God. And here I'm referring specifically to the healing practices that involve the spiritual, that involve God. So that is the peak of knowing about God. But there's also a peak that I call the peak of knowing God. And it is very, very different than the peak of knowing about God. And notice that I have hyphenated knowing God. And I've done that because knowing God is a state of being. In other words, it's a part of who you become. It's not a part of what you know in your head. It's not how well you know the Bible. It's not how well you understand the teachings of your faith. It's not how well you can comment on various things. It's not, what level of academic prowess you have achieved in your specific spiritual training. The peak of knowing a God is knowing God is an internal state, and it comes from meditation and prayer and meditative prayer, and it comes from nature, and it comes from the ability to immerse yourself in the direct healing presence of God over and over again. And it comes from the idea that you as a human being can participate in the emptiness of space and all of the other things that I will talk about as we go through. Now, the reason for putting both of these mountains onto this display is that they're both important. Okay, if we're going to heal, they're both important. But our culture, our Western culture, has de-emphasized the knowing God mountain in favor of the knowing about God mountain. And it should be, in my opinion, reversed. We should be much more interested in the knowing God state of being. And so that's the reason for putting that there, and as a way of sort of, I guess, introducing you to all the rest of the spiritual practices. Because the spiritual practices, the healing practices, as I have called them, are going to focus on this knowing God state. And, as I said earlier, that will in turn focus on that part of you that can reactivate being gentle with yourself, being gentle with that tender area inside that may have been wounded along the way.